James Aldridge strutted into the courtroom like a king walking into his palace. A man of immense wealth, his name was synonymous with power and influence in New York's elite circles. From sprawling mansions in the Hamptons to luxurious penthouses overlooking Manhattan, James had it all, or so it seemed. Behind his tailored suits and million-dollar smile lay a darker truth. Aldridge had built his empire, Aldridge Capital, on lies and exploitation. Promising financial security to hard-working families, he instead drained their life savings to fund his extravagant lifestyle. The courtroom buzzed with tension as stories of ruined lives echoed through the chamber. Parents who lost their children's college funds, retirees stripped of their pensions, all victims of Aldridge's schemes. Yet, as the evidence mounted, James sat unbothered, his smirk defiant, daring the system to hold him accountable. For him, justice was just another game to manipulate. James Aldridge wasn't just rich, he was the type of rich that made headlines. His name graced the covers of financial magazines, hailed as the visionary behind Aldridge Capital. But behind the glamorous facade of private jets, celebrity-studded galas, and luxurious yachts lay a carefully constructed empire of lies. For years, James had promised stability and success to middle-class families and small business owners, enticing them with dreams of a secure future. "Trust us with your life savings," his ads proclaimed. "We'll make your money work for you." It was a pitch so polished it felt genuine. But in reality, it was a cruel game of deception. The victims were diverse: single parents saving for their kids' college, elderly couples banking on their retirement funds, and young entrepreneurs with dreams of expanding their businesses. Each story painted a grim picture of hope shattered by betrayal. Among them was Laura Bennett, a widow from Ohio who invested her late husband's life insurance payout with Aldridge Capital, only to lose it all within months. "He didn't just take my money," she later said, voice trembling. "He took my future, my children's future." What made James's crimes particularly insidious was how deliberate they were. Emails unearthed by federal investigators revealed his true intentions. "These people don't ask questions," one email read. "Make the numbers look good, we just need them to sign." It wasn't just business incompetence, it was predatory and calculated. James and his team of executives knew the devastation they were causing but dismissed it as collateral damage. To them, their victims weren't families. They were opportunities to fund another gala or luxury vacation. When investigators began to close in, James's arrogance only grew. Confident in his wealth and influence, he dismissed the mounting evidence with a wave of his hand. "It's all noise," he told his inner circle. "I've got the best lawyers in the country. This won't stick." His legal team launched a full-scale defense campaign, portraying him as a misunderstood genius and scapegoat for economic woes. For a time, it seemed like he might escape justice. The trial was delayed for months as his lawyers filed motion after motion, a tactic designed to wear down the prosecution. But the tide began to turn when the evidence was presented in court. On the second day of the trial, the prosecution played a damning audio recording where James could be heard laughing about his victims. "If they're dumb enough to hand over their savings, that's not my fault," he said. The room fell silent, the air thick with disgust. Laura Bennett, seated in the front row, covered her mouth in shock. Yet, even as his empire crumbled, James remained unfazed. His smirk never wavered, his confidence unwavering. To him, this was just another performance, a chance to charm the audience, manipulate the system, and walk away unscathed. But as the gavel struck and Judge Rebecca Chen leaned forward, her piercing gaze locked on him, one thing became clear. James Aldridge was about to learn that even kings could fall. The courtroom was electric with tension on the third day of James Aldridge's trial. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised to capture every word, while victims sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with anger and despair. Despite the gravity of the situation, James was unfazed. Dressed in another impeccable suit, he lounged in his chair as if he were attending a business meeting, not facing charges of fraud that had ruined countless lives. His smug grin and casual demeanor only fueled the outrage simmering in the room. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented emails, audio recordings, and bank statements, all pointing to a deliberate and calculated scheme. One damning piece of evidence, an email where James referred to his clients as suckers, drew audible gasps from the audience. The prosecutor's voice rang through the room as she read his words. Push harder for the middle-class accounts. They're desperate to believe in something, and that's our edge. The words hung in the air like a poison cloud, suffocating any lingering doubt about his guilt. In the front row, Laura Bennett clenched her fists, her knuckles white. Beside her sat Jack Martin, a retired Army veteran who had lost his life savings to Aldrich Capital. Jack's jaw tightened as he muttered under his breath. He knew exactly what he was doing. Yet James didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone, his expression one of complete indifference. The tension reached a boiling point when the prosecution called Laura to the stand. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a piece of paper, her voice shaking as she recounted the day her life fell apart. "I trusted him," she said, her voice cracking. "I trusted him with everything, and he destroyed it all." Tears streamed down her face as she described the foreclosure on her home, the sleepless nights in her car with her 2 children, and the endless feeling of shame. The room was silent, save for the muffled sobs of other victims. James didn't even look at her. Instead, he leaned over to his attorney and whispered something that drew a chuckle. The prosecutor, catching the exchange, stopped mid-question and turned to Judge Rebecca Chen. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp. "The defendant is clearly not paying attention." All eyes shifted to Judge Chen, her gaze, sharp and unwavering, locked onto James. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, her tone measured but steely, "put your phone away. Now." James looked up, his smirk intact. "I was just checking something important," he replied, holding up the phone as if to justify his actions. The judge's expression hardened. "This is not a boardroom, Mr. Aldrich. It's a courtroom, and you will show respect, or face the consequences." Reluctantly, James set the phone down, but his defiance was palpable. The crowd murmured in disbelief at his audacity, the anger in the room almost tangible. Laura's testimony continued, but her voice carried the weight of betrayal and disbelief. By the end of the day, the atmosphere was suffocating. Victims sat in stunned silence, their heartbreak laid bare for the world to see. And yet, James Aldrich remained as arrogant as ever, convinced that his wealth and influence would shield him from justice. But Judge Chen's sharp gaze and the growing mountain of evidence suggested otherwise. The game James thought he was playing was quickly unraveling, and for the first time, cracks began to show in his unshakable confidence. The trial reached a fever pitch as the prosecution prepared to rest its case. Witness after witness had taken the stand, weaving a tapestry of betrayal, greed, and shattered lives. The gallery was packed each day with victims and spectators eager to see justice served. But through it all, James Aldrich remained unshaken, his arrogance an infuriating constant. To him, this trial wasn't about justice. It was a show, and he was the star. The courtroom was abuzz as the prosecution called its final witness, Jack Martin, the retired Army veteran who had lost everything to Aldrich Capital. Jack walked to the stand with a quiet dignity, his uniform-like posture and calm demeanor a stark contrast to James's smugness. As he began to testify, the room fell silent. "I served my country for 25 years, Jack began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I fought to protect the American dream. But James Aldrich turned that dream into a nightmare." He recounted how he had saved every penny of his pension to ensure a secure future for himself and his wife. "When I handed over my savings, I trusted him. I believed in his promises. And in return, he took everything: my home, my security, my pride." The weight of Jack's words hung in the air, and the room was visibly moved. Even reporters, usually detached, put down their pens, captivated by the raw emotion. But James? He leaned back in his chair, barely suppressing a yawn, as if the testimony was beneath his attention. The prosecutor, seizing the moment, turned her gaze to James. "Mr. Aldrich," she said sharply, "do you have anything to say to Mr. Martin, to the man whose life you destroyed?" James smirked, leaning into the microphone with a dismissive shrug. "It's unfortunate," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But I can't be responsible for every bad investment decision. That's just business." The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of outrage. Jack's jaw tightened, his composure cracking as he stared down the man who had reduced his life to rubble. Judge Rebecca Chen's gavel struck sharply, silencing the uproar. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, her voice low but commanding, "you are walking a dangerous line. This is a court of law, not a boardroom. Show respect, or face the consequences." For a moment, James's smirk faltered, but it returned just as quickly, a clear signal he believed himself untouchable. The prosecution's final blow came in the form of a recorded phone call played for the court. In the audio, James could be heard laughing with his executives, calling his clients gullible and joking about their desperation. The room froze as the recording played, the laughter echoing like a cruel reminder of his indifference. In the front row, Laura Bennett buried her face in her hands, her sobs breaking the silence. Jack sat rigid, his fists clenched tightly. Even the spectators, who had expected arrogance, seemed shocked by the sheer callousness. As the recording ended, the prosecutor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady but impassioned, "this is who James Aldridge truly is. A man who sees people not as individuals, but as tools for his greed. Today you have the power to ensure he faces the consequences he's evaded for so long." The courtroom erupted into murmurs once again, the tension reaching its peak. Judge Chen's gavel slammed down. "Order in the court," she commanded, her piercing gaze fixed on James. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. The evidence was damning, the victims' testimonies devastating. James Aldridge's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and he knew it. The walls of his empire were closing in, and for the first time, he began to sense the weight of accountability bearing down on him. The final day of James Aldridge's trial arrived with an intensity that seemed to charge the air. By dawn, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, victims, and onlookers eager to witness the conclusion of a case that had gripped the nation. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Victims clutched one another's hands, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and fragile hope. Aldridge, however, was as composed as ever, lounging at the defense table in yet another designer suit, his smirk firmly in place. The courtroom hushed as Judge Rebecca Chen entered, her black robe billowing as she approached the bench. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room stood in unison. As Judge Chen sat, she surveyed the room with her usual calm authority, her eyes briefly landing on James. "Mr. Aldridge," she began, her voice steady, "you have been found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the harm you've caused to hundreds of families is incalculable." James leaned back in his chair, his smirk unfaltering. He looked like a man convinced he would leave the courtroom unscathed, his wealth and influence protecting him as they always had. Judge Chen continued, her voice growing sharper. "Throughout this trial, you have shown no remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom, your disrespect toward the victims, the court, and the legal process has been nothing short of disgraceful. You have treated this as a game, as if the lives you destroyed are mere collateral damage in your pursuit of wealth and power." Murmurs rippled through the gallery as Judge Chen's words cut through the air. Victims sat on the edge of their seats, hanging on every word. Laura Bennett, her hands tightly clasped, whispered a silent prayer. Jack Martin stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, as if willing justice to be served. The judge's tone turned icy, her next words weighted with finality. "Justice is not about wealth, privilege, or influence. It is about accountability, and today you will be held accountable." James's smirk faltered, his posture stiffening as the weight of her words began to sink in. "I hereby sentence you, James Aldridge, to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole," Judge Chen declared. Gasps erupted from the gallery, followed by a stunned silence. James's face turned pale, his usual composure cracking. Judge Chen wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets. Every ill-gotten dollar will be used to compensate the victims of your crimes. This court will not allow your greed to prevail over justice." A roar of approval swept through the courtroom. Laura Bennett broke into tears, her sobs a mixture of relief and vindication. Jack Martin leaned back in his seat, his eyes glistening as he whispered, "Finally." James shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I'm James Aldridge. You'll regret this." Judge Chen's gavel slammed down, her expression unyielding. "Mr. Aldridge, sit down. This is my courtroom, and you will respect its authority." As bailiffs moved to escort him out, James continued to shout, his protests growing fainter with each step. The courtroom erupted into applause, a rare and extraordinary display of emotion in such a solemn setting. For the victims, it wasn't just about the years he would serve. It was about the message. As the crowd filtered out, Laura and Jack stood on the courthouse steps, the weight of their ordeal finally beginning to lift. "It won't bring back what we lost," Laura said, her voice steady, "but it's a start." Jack nodded, his gaze on the reporters swarming for statements. "It's not just about us. It's about making sure people like him can't do this again." Inside her chambers, Judge Chen watched the scene unfold below. She felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve. Today was a reminder that no one, not even the most powerful, was above the law. Justice had been served, and the world was watching. The verdict sent shockwaves across the nation, sparking conversations about justice, accountability, and the unchecked power of the wealthy. News outlets dissected every detail of James Aldridge's downfall, replaying the trial's pivotal moments and broadcasting Judge Rebecca Chen's sharp condemnation. The name James Aldridge became synonymous with greed, arrogance, and the price of betrayal. Yet, for the victims, the trial was more than a headline. It was the start of a long road to healing. Outside the courthouse, victims gathered in clusters, some sharing cautious smiles, others exchanging heartfelt embraces. Laura Bennett, still clutching a tissue in one hand, stood with her children as reporters swarmed around her. When asked how she felt about the sentence, she paused, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "This isn't just about me or my family. This is about every person who trusted someone and paid the price for their greed. Today we got justice, but rebuilding starts tomorrow." Beside her, Jack Martin, the retired veteran, nodded in agreement as he spoke to a small crowd. "This isn't just a victory for the victims here," he said. "It's a message to anyone who thinks they're untouchable. The system worked today, and that gives me hope for the future." While many celebrated, James Aldridge's supporters maintained their defense, calling the sentence excessive and politically motivated. His legal team released a carefully worded statement promising an appeal. But the public's sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of the verdict. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Justice for the Victims" and "No One Above the Law," with countless users sharing their own stories of exploitation and betrayal. The trial had become a rallying cry for change. Judge Chen's decision to liquidate Aldridge's assets brought tangible relief to the victims. Within weeks, restitution payments began reaching families. Laura received enough to put a down payment on a new home, and Jack was finally able to secure a modest retirement plan. "It's not just about the money," Jack later said in an interview. "It's about the acknowledgement that what he did was wrong. That matters." But beyond the courtroom, the story took on a life of its own. Advocacy groups began pushing for tighter regulations on financial firms, using Aldridge's case as an example of the need for reform. Lawmakers debated bills aimed at increasing accountability for corporate leaders, while investigative journalists uncovered other potential schemes, inspired by Aldridge's fraudulent tactics. For Judge Rebecca Chen, the case was a stark reminder of her responsibility to uphold the integrity of the justice system. In her chambers, she reflected on the trial's aftermath, the faces of the victims etched in her memory. "Justice isn't perfect," she later told a journalist, "but it's about trying, about showing people that their voices matter, no matter how powerful the opposition." As weeks turned into months, James Aldridge's name faded from the headlines, but the impact of his trial remained. Laura and her children began to rebuild their lives, the shadow of despair gradually lifting. Jack returned to his community, volunteering to help other veterans navigate financial planning. Across the country, the case inspired countless individuals to demand better protections and to believe, perhaps for the first time, that justice wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was achievable. In the end, the trial of James Aldridge wasn't just a story of greed and punishment. It was a testament to resilience, the power of ordinary people standing against extraordinary odds, and the enduring belief that, no matter how daunting the fight, justice will prevail. As the dust settled from James Aldridge's trial, its ripples spread far beyond the courtroom. His name became a cautionary tale, a symbol of unchecked greed and the reckoning that followed. For the victims, the verdict was a beginning, not an end. Laura Bennett, now back on her feet with a new home and a renewed sense of stability, often reflected on the journey. "It's not just about the money," she said in an interview. "It's about knowing someone listened, that justice was possible even against someone like him." Jack Martin, the retired veteran who had lost everything, turned his personal loss into purpose. Partnering with local nonprofits, he began educating others about financial literacy and warning signs of fraud. "If my story can stop even one person from going through what I did, it's worth it," he said, his resolve a testament to his resilience. Beyond the individual stories, the trial ignited broader changes. Advocacy groups lobbied for stricter financial regulations, using Aldridge's crimes as a rallying point. Lawmakers introduced bills to close loopholes and increase corporate accountability. The public, emboldened by the victims' courage, demanded reforms to ensure that no one else could exploit the vulnerable so easily. Judge Rebecca Chen's ruling, praised for its firmness and fairness, became a landmark moment. In speeches and interviews, she reminded people of the trial's deeper lesson. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration, about giving victims a voice and ensuring the system works for everyone. As the nation moved forward, the legacy of James Aldridge's trial endured, a stark reminder of the power of accountability and the resilience of those who fight for justice, no matter the odds. The verdict in James Aldridge's trial not only brought justice to the victims, but also sparked a nationwide conversation about fairness, accountability, and systemic reform. Families who had been silenced by shame and despair now found their voices. Laura Bennett, once displaced and broken, began speaking at community events, sharing her story to inspire others. "Justice isn't just about the courtroom," she said. "It's about finding the courage to stand up and fight back." Jack Martin, the retired veteran, became a local advocate for financial education, using his own hardship as a warning to others. His workshops drew crowds eager to learn how to protect themselves from fraud. "Aldridge may be behind bars," he often said, "but we have to stay vigilant. There are always others willing to take his place." The trial also created a seismic shift in public policy. Activists seized the moment to demand stronger financial protections, while lawmakers pushed through legislation that increased penalties for corporate fraud. Headlines declared it the Aldridge effect, a reminder of how one case could spark broader change. Meanwhile, Judge Rebecca Chen's words during sentencing continued to resonate. Justice is not just about punishing the guilty. It's about restoring the balance and ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The legacy of the trial endured, proving that resilience, courage, and accountability could triumph over even the greatest injustices. In 2025, the story of James Aldridge serves as a powerful reminder that no individual, regardless of wealth or influence, is beyond the reach of justice. It highlights the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable communities from exploitation and the need for systemic reforms to prevent such abuses. The trial reinforced that accountability is not just a legal concept, but a societal responsibility. As we face a rapidly evolving financial landscape, the lessons from this case urge us to demand transparency, advocate for fairness, and ensure that justice remains a guiding principle in a world often shaped by power and greed. Let's stand with the victims like Laura Bennett and Jack Martin, who turned their pain into purpose, and support their ongoing fight for justice and reform. Share their stories, raise awareness about financial fraud, and advocate for stronger protections against exploitation. Encourage leaders to prioritize accountability and transparency in corporate practices. For Laura and Jack, the next step is clear. Continue inspiring others by speaking out and leading efforts to educate communities. Together we can amplify their voices, demand change, and create a future where no one else has to endure the devastation caused by greed and deception.